Chapter 1: The Silver Giants of the Sky. There is a peculiar, forgotten quality to the way human history moves forward. Sometimes, it feels less like a continuous, unyielding river and more like a path full of quiet, overgrown turns, roads left untraveled that might have led to a completely different world. If we could peel back the layers of time and look closely at the skies of the late 1920s, we would discover a landscape that feels almost mythical to the modern mind. It was an era when the heavens did not belong to the loud, restless roar of high-altitude airplanes, but to the majestic, utterly silent rulers of the air. The airships, the great Zeppelins. They were often called the silver clouds, or the floating ocean liners of the sky, moving across continents and oceans with an almost supernatural grace, so quietly that people on the ground could hear nothing but the deep, soothing, and distant hum of their massive engines. Imagine standing on a quiet stone balcony in London, Paris, or New York during those autumn evenings, just as the last amber rays of dusk begin to settle over the slate rooftops. The evening mist is rising from the streets, and then, without a single sudden sound, a vast shadow gently sweeps over the neighborhood. You look up into the twilight, and there it is, a silver titan, stretching for 3 football fields in length, hanging effortlessly in the cooling air. Its smooth, fabric-covered hull reflects the deep purples and soft golds of the dying sun. It does not shake, it does not struggle violently against gravity, it does not leave a dark trail of smoke behind. It simply floats, perfectly integrated into the natural geometry of the evening sky, a peaceful island drifting through a sea of clouds. Inside these immense, rigid duralumin frames lay a world designed for an entirely different pace of human existence. These were not mere transportation vehicles meant to rush a passenger from one hectic terminal to another. They were luxurious flying sanctuaries, crafted for a slower, more deliberate era of travel. There were spacious dining rooms where tables were immaculately set with fine white porcelain and heavy silver. There were small grand pianos constructed from lightweight wood, secured to thick, sound-dampening carpets, and long promenades lined with large, slanted panoramic windows. A traveler could lean against the polished mahogany railings and spend hours watching the Atlantic Ocean roll far beneath them, a vast, dark blue canvas shifting sleepily under the moonlight. There was no turbulent shaking, no high-pitched engine whine, and no modern urgency. To travel by airship was to embrace a profound, unhurried architecture of silence. But beneath this beautiful exterior of luxury and peace, a silent, invisible war of economics was already beginning to take shape. The airships represented a fork in the road of human progress, a choice between a technology that worked in harmony with the natural physics of the atmosphere and one that sought to conquer it through sheer mechanical force. For a few brief years, it seemed as though the gentler path would win. The great silver ships crossed oceans with flawless precision, capturing the imagination of the entire world. Yet, behind the closed doors of global finance, their very efficiency was being calculated as a threat to the emerging industrial empires of the 20th century. As you listen to the rhythmic, comforting hum of this hidden history, your mind can appreciate the sheer elegance of these forgotten machines. They sailed through an era of pure potential, carrying a promise of a quieter, more balanced world. The silver giants belonged to the sky, moving with the patience of clouds and the reliability of the tides. And as the night deepens, we leave them floating peacefully in the high altitudes of the past, their engines humming a slow, steady lullaby over a sleeping world that was about to change forever. Chapter 2: The Energy of the Future. To truly grasp the hidden forces that moved against the airship, one must look closely at the mathematical and physical reality of how these machines operated. In the early decades of the 20th century, humanity stood at a fascinating crossroads of engineering, searching for the most efficient way to conquer distance and bridge the continents. On one side stood the airplane, heavy, fragile, and fundamentally aggressive in its relationship with nature. On the other side stood the airship, a vehicle designed around the concept of absolute harmony with the natural laws of the atmosphere. The difference between these two technologies was not merely a matter of shape, speed, or size. It was an entirely different relationship with energy. It is this unique relationship that made the airship a masterpiece of sustainable design and, simultaneously, a dangerous target for the emerging industrial monopolies of the modern world. Consider the mechanics of flight as a gentle balance of physical forces. Every airplane, from the smallest canvas biplane of the 1920s to the heavy metal transport liners that followed, is locked in a constant, violent struggle against the gravitational pull of the Earth. An airplane is an inherently heavy object. In order to stay aloft, it must continuously move forward at high speeds, using its powerful engines to force air over the curved surfaces of its wings. This movement creates lift, but it requires a punishing, uninterrupted expenditure of energy. The moment an airplane's engines fall silent, the lift disappears, and gravity reclaims the machine. Because of this, an airplane is forced to consume vast quantities of fuel simply to exist in the sky, wasting immense amounts of energy just to maintain its altitude before it can even begin to cover distance across the ground. The airship, however, had bypassed this energetic struggle entirely through a brilliant application of static buoyancy. Inside the immense, rigid framework of a Zeppelin lay a series of massive gas cells, filled with an element lighter than the surrounding air. This meant that the airship did not need to fight the Earth to stay aloft. It was held in the sky by the natural, quiet physics of displacement. A 300-ton silver giant floated in the atmosphere just as effortlessly as a wooden ship floats upon the surface of a calm, glassy ocean. It required exactly zero fuel, zero engine power, and zero forward movement to maintain its altitude. It could hover in one place for hours, days, or even weeks, suspended in a state of perfect, weightless equilibrium. Because the problem of gravity had been solved by the physics of buoyancy, the airship's engines had only one simple task: to provide horizontal propulsion. They were needed only to push the vessel forward through the air currents, smoothly and rhythmically. This meant that an airship required a mere fraction of the horsepower and fuel that an airplane needed to carry the same amount of weight over the same distance. The massive Maybach diesel engines of the great German Zeppelins did not roar with a high-pitched, desperate violence. They operated at a slow, majestic cadence, turning immense wooden propellers with a deep, bass-heavy hum that sounded more like a peaceful industrial heartbeat than a machine of war. This efficiency allowed them to achieve a level of autonomy that modern commercial aviation still cannot match. The range of these silver giants was truly extraordinary. While the airplanes of the 1930s were fragile machines that had to stop every few hundred miles to refuel at expensive, specialized airfields, the airships treated the entire planet as a single, uninterrupted highway. A commercial Zeppelin could take off from Germany, cross the vast expanses of the Atlantic Ocean, fly over the dense forests of South America, and land safely in Rio de Janeiro without a single stop for fuel or maintenance. They were capable of remaining airborne for thousands of miles at a time, carrying dozens of passengers, tons of cargo, and luxury accommodations across the globe while consuming less fuel than a small fleet of contemporary surface ships. This spectacular efficiency was not just a triumph for the passengers who enjoyed the quiet, vibration-free cabins. It was a profound vision for a different kind of human civilization. It was a future where global travel did not require the destructive, aggressive exploitation of natural resources. The airship represented a path toward an ecological equilibrium, a world where humanity could bridge the continents by working with the natural currents of the atmosphere rather than trying to overpower them with brute mechanical force. It was a technology that promised infinite connection with minimal consumption, a beautifully quiet world where the sky remained clean, silent, and undisturbed. But as the 1930s opened, this vision of elegant efficiency began to clash with the harsh realities of global finance and industrial consolidation. To the small group of powerful syndicates who were rapidly gaining control of the world's oil reserves, a transportation technology that required almost no fuel was not a miracle to be celebrated. It was a severe economic crisis in the making. The modern industrial machine was being built on the assumption of endless growth and insatiable resource consumption. The airplane, with its massive, unavoidable thirst for high-octane petroleum, was the perfect vehicle to fuel the profits of the emerging oil empires. The airship, by contrast, was too independent, too efficient, and too gentle on the earth. It was a beautiful alternative that threatened to show humanity that there was another way to move forward, a way that did not require the endless burning of fossil fuels. And so, behind the closed doors of boardrooms and political offices, the architecture of silence began to look like a target. As you listen to the rhythmic, comforting hum of this hidden history, your mind can appreciate the sheer elegance of these forgotten machines. They sailed through an era of pure potential, carrying a promise of a quieter, more balanced world. The silver giants belong to the sky, moving with the patience of clouds and the reliability of the tides. And as the night deepens, we leave them floating peacefully in the high altitudes of the past, their engines humming a slow, steady lullaby over a sleeping world that was about to change forever. Chapter 3: The Fuel Monopoly. To truly understand how the magnificent era of the airship came to a sudden and quiet end, one must look away from the open skies and step into the dim, wood-paneled boardrooms of the early 20th century. It was here, far from the fresh mountain winds and the silver clouds, that a new kind of power was being consolidated. This was the age of the great industrial syndicates, a small, interconnected network of oil barons, chemical manufacturers, and financial monopolists who were rapidly reshaping the global economy. To these men, the world was no longer a landscape of natural beauty to be harmonized with. It was a vast map of resources to be extracted, refined, and sold. And at the absolute center of this new empire stood a single, dark, and incredibly lucrative substance: petroleum. As the 1920s transitioned into the 1930s, the emerging oil empires were realizing that their future survival depended entirely on creating a permanent, inescapable human dependency on fossil fuels. The automobile had already secured the land, transforming cities into networks of paved roads that required endless millions of barrels of gasoline. But the sky remained an open question. The future of global transportation was being decided, and two completely different technologies were competing for the soul of the heavens. On one side was the commercial airplane, a machine with a desperate, insatiable thirst for specialized, high-octane aviation fuel. On the other side was the rigid airship, an elegant titan that could cross the planet using little more than the natural buoyancy of gas and a microscopic fraction of cheap, heavy diesel. The economics of the airship were deeply troubling to the financial syndicates. A commercial Zeppelin, like the famous Graf Zeppelin, was an object of terrifying efficiency for an oil monopolist. Because the airship bypassed the energy-intensive struggle against gravity, its fuel consumption was almost entirely linear, used only to maintain a steady forward momentum through the air currents. In 1929, when the Graf Zeppelin made its historic, record-breaking flight around the world, it carried dozens of passengers, heavy mail, and cargo across 21,000 miles of land and ocean. The entire epoch-defining journey was completed consuming less fuel than a standard Atlantic steamship would burn in a single afternoon, and a mere fraction of what a fleet of contemporary airplanes would require to cover even a quarter of that distance. For the oil conglomerates, this was not a triumph of human genius to be rewarded. It was a profound threat to their long-term profit models. If the airship became the dominant mode of international travel, the global demand for petroleum would remain dangerously low. Humanity would learn to move between continents with minimal resource consumption, embracing a lifestyle of patience, sustainability, and ecological balance. The airplane, by contrast, was an oil baron's dream. An airplane required vast amounts of energy just to lift its own metal frame off the runway, and even more to push through the dense lower atmosphere at high speeds. It was a machine that inherently wasted energy, converting massive volumes of expensive, highly refined fuel into noise, heat, and speed. The choice for the syndicates was clear. The airplane had to win, not because it was better, safer, or more comfortable, but because its systemic inefficiency guaranteed a permanent, multi-billion-dollar market for the oil industry. The hostility toward the airship was rarely overt or loud. Instead, it took the form of a slow, calculated financial starvation. The industrial syndicates began to use their immense banking influence to choke off the capital needed to build the massive infrastructure that airships required. To operate a global network of Zeppelins, cities needed to construct immense hangars, complex hydrogen and helium manufacturing plants, and high-altitude mooring masts. These projects required significant long-term investments. Slowly but deliberately, the major financial institutions, many of which held massive blocks of stock in the emerging petroleum and automotive sectors, began to deny loans and credit lines to airship development companies. At the same time, massive financial backing began to pour into the young commercial airline companies. Subsidies from governments, heavily influenced by industrial lobbying, were directed toward the development of faster, heavier-than-air craft. The public narrative was quietly but systematically shifted through corporate-sponsored publications and engineering journals. The airship was gradually painted not as the clean, majestic future of sustainable transit, but as a slow, lumbering relic of a bygone era. Speed was elevated to the highest virtue of modern civilization, while the virtues of comfort, silence, and ecological harmony were quietly pushed to the margins of public consciousness. The syndicates understood that if they could delay the growth of the airship industry for just a single decade, the exponential advancement of petroleum-powered engine technology would allow the airplane to catch up in terms of practical range, eventually forcing the silver giants out of the market through sheer political and economic pressure. It was a silent, invisible war of attrition, fought with ledgers, stock options, and legislative influence behind closed doors, while the great silver ships continued to glide peacefully above the clouds, completely unaware of the economic net that was being woven beneath them. As you drift deeper into the quiet security of the night, the image of these independent, efficient giants serves as a peaceful reminder of a time when technology could have taken a gentler path. The airships belonged to a world that valued the sky, moving with the unhurried grace of the wind and the absolute dependability of natural physics. And as the darkness wraps around the Earth, we leave the silver giants floating safely in the quiet altitudes of history, their engines ticking over with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, guarding a dream of a cleaner, calmer world while the busy machinery of the modern world slowly fades into silence. Chapter 4: The Cage of Geography. To understand how a technology as magnificent as the rigid airship could be systematically contained, one must look beyond the financial ledgers and examine the cold, unyielding realities of global geography. In the natural order of things, the sky knows no borders. To a Zeppelin gliding effortlessly through the stratosphere, the continents are not separate entities divided by political friction, but a single, continuous canvas of winds and currents. Yet, while the airships themselves were inherently free from the constraints of the Earth, the elements that allowed them to exist were deeply bound to the soil. As the late 1920s approached, the invisible syndicates discovered that the most effective way to dismantle the airship empire was not to fight it in the open sky, but to lock it within a cage of geographical monopoly. The most critical vulnerability of any lighter-than-air vessel has always been the gas that gives it life. While the laws of physics provide the lift, nature was remarkably selective about where she hid the elements necessary for safe flight. Hydrogen, the lightest gas in the universe, could be manufactured relatively easily anywhere on Earth through chemical processes. It was highly efficient and incredibly buoyant, but it carried a tragic, volatile flaw. It was highly flammable. There existed, however, a perfect alternative: helium. Helium offered nearly identical lifting power, but it was completely inert, meaning it could never burn, explode, or catch fire. It was the ultimate guardian of safety for high-altitude passenger travel. But helium was not distributed evenly across the globe. It was a rare, precious subterranean treasure, and almost the entire known supply of it was trapped deep beneath the ancient rock formations of the United States. For many years, the brilliant engineers at the Zeppelin Company in Germany had watched the development of American gas extraction with deep hope. They envisioned a future where their magnificent passenger liners would be filled with this non-flammable American helium, making global airship travel completely impervious to the dangers of accident or sabotage. But the industrial and political syndicates in Washington had a completely different vision. They recognized that by controlling the global supply of helium, they held an absolute veto power over the future of international aviation. If they withheld this single element, they could ensure that any foreign competitor would remain inherently vulnerable, forced to rely on the dangerous volatility of hydrogen. This geopolitical strategy was solidified into law with the passage of the American Helium Act of 1927. With a single stroke of a pen, the United States government placed a strict, absolute embargo on the export of helium. The law declared that this precious gas was a strategic military asset of the highest order, making it completely illegal to sell or ship even a single cubic foot of helium outside the borders of the United States. It was a masterpiece of legislative isolation. The official justification presented to the public was one of national security and defense, but beneath the surface, the act functioned as an economic chokehold. It effectively built an invisible, geographic wall around the German airship industry, separating the world's greatest master builders of Zeppelins from the only gas that could guarantee the permanent safety of their passengers. The impact of this law on the German engineers was profound and deeply felt. In Friedrichshafen, on the shores of Lake Constance, the great designers found themselves in a heartbreaking dilemma. They possessed the blueprints, the duralumin, and the unmatched craftsmanship to build a fleet of silver giants that could connect every continent on Earth. They had the trust of the global public. Yet, every time they looked at their massive creations, they knew they were being forced to build them with a compromise at their very core. Because of the Helium Act, they had no choice but to continue using hydrogen. They were forced to rely on a gas that required absolute, flawless perfection in every wire, every engine exhaust, and every electrical connection, knowing that the slightest spark could transform their masterpiece into a tragedy. The American Helium Act did not just protect a domestic resource, it created an artificial imbalance in the evolution of flight. While American aviation companies could develop their own airships and airplanes backed by the security of boundless domestic resources, the rest of the world was left geographically stranded. The great German Zeppelins, despite their flawless safety record throughout the late 20s and early 30s, were forced to operate under a constant cloud of manufactured risk. The public did not see the closed-door political maneuvers or the lobbying by energy syndicates that kept the helium trapped in the Texas soil. They only saw that the German ships were flying on a dangerous substance. The cage of geography had been successfully locked, and the key was held firmly by the very forces that wished to see the skies filled with the loud, oil-thirsty engines of the airplane. As you rest in the deep, undisturbed quiet of the evening, The memory of these isolated giants invites your mind into a state of serene contemplation. The silver ships continued to fly despite the boundaries placed upon them, navigating the high, lonely pathways of the world with an unhurried dignity that no law could ever take away. They belonged to an ideal of global unity, moving like silent ghosts across the borders of men. And as the darkness deepens across the landscape, we leave them floating peacefully in the calm currents of yesterday, their engines humming a soft, rhythmic reassurance into the night, guarding their beautiful, quiet dream until the world wakes up to a new dawn. Chapter 5. The Hydrogen Trap. To enter the grand, echoing spaces of the Zeppelin construction hangars in Friedrichshafen during the early 1930s was to step into a cathedral of pure intellect and unmatched devotion. Inside these immense structures, shielded from the cold winds of Lake Constance, the finest minds of a generation worked in near silence. These were men who spoke the language of stress vectors, structural load balances, and metallurgical limits. They were not politicians or financial operators. They were purists of engineering who believed that a machine, if built with absolute precision, could become a flawless extension of the natural world. Yet, as they stood looking up at the majestic, skeletal frameworks of their newest creations, a heavy, unexpressed shadow hung over their drafting tables. They knew they were being systematically cornered into a dangerous technical compromise. They were trapped inside the hydrogen paradigm. With the American Helium Act of 1927 firmly in place, the dream of filling these silver giants with an unburnable, inert gas had vanished. The geopolitical embargo had left the German engineers with an ultimatum: either abandon the majestic future of international airship travel entirely, or master the most volatile element in the universe. Choosing the path of courage and defiance, they turned their immense intellect toward managing the invisible, engineered risks of hydrogen. They knew that if they were to carry thousands of passengers across the turbulent expanses of the Atlantic, their designs could not merely be good, they had to be completely perfect. They had to build a machine where human error, mechanical friction, and the chaotic nature of atmospheric electricity were entirely neutralized by the sheer brilliance of design. The engineering solutions they developed to manage this permanent risk were nothing short of miraculous. To prevent the slightest possibility of a static spark, the ultimate enemy of a hydrogen vessel, every single piece of the airship's immense duralumin structure was meticulously bonded together. Thousands of miles of delicate copper wiring ran through the giant frame, connecting every longitudinal girder, every ring, and every engine car into a single, unified electrical network. This ensured that the entire ship maintained the exact same electrical potential as the surrounding atmosphere. As the Zeppelin glided through charged thunderclouds or heavy mist, the atmospheric electricity did not strike the ship. Instead, it flowed smoothly across its silver skin and dissipated harmlessly into the sky, like water sliding off the back of a swan. The giant gas cells themselves, which held millions of cubic feet of hydrogen, were treated with a level of care that bordered on the sacred. They were constructed from multiple layers of gold-beater skin, the incredibly tough, gas-tight outer membrane of cow intestines, painstakingly glued onto sheets of fine cotton fabric. The workers who assembled these cells wore soft cloth shoes and used specialized tools made of non-sparking bronze or wood. Every seam was inspected by hand under magnifying glasses, and the air inside the hull was constantly monitored by delicate chemical sensors that could detect the microscopic presence of a gas leak long before it could pose a danger. The engineers created a system of immense ventilation shafts that ran vertically through the center of the ship, using the natural chimney effect to draw any stray hydrogen up and out into the open sky, far away from the passenger quarters and the engine exhausts. The massive Maybach diesel engines were also heavily modified to fit this architecture of extreme caution. Traditional gasoline engines, with their high-voltage spark plugs and volatile fuel vapors, were considered far too dangerous for a hydrogen airship. Instead, the engineers pioneered the use of heavy, slow-burning crude oil diesel. The exhaust systems were fitted with elaborate water recovery apparatuses, which cooled the burning gases down to near-room temperature before they left the ship, eliminating any trace of open flame or flying sparks. These engines did not roar with the desperate intensity of an airplane power plant. They turned with a deep, low, and rhythmic thrum, a peaceful mechanical heartbeat that reassured the passengers as they slept soundly in their cabins above. 4 years, this masterpiece of engineered safety worked flawlessly. The Banned Zeppelin flew over 1 million miles, crossing the oceans and even the frozen wastes of the Arctic without injuring a single passenger, proving to the world that human intellect could tame even the most volatile forces of nature. The German engineers had successfully transformed a potential trap into a triumph of sustainable engineering. But the invisible syndicates who watched from the shadows understood that this perfection was a fragile one. No matter how brilliant the engineering was, it was still a system operating under tension, a technology forced to exist on the knife edge of safety because the safer alternative was locked away in the American earth. The risk had been managed, but it had not been eliminated, and as long as the Silver Giants flew on hydrogen, they remained vulnerable to the one thing that no engineer could ever fully calculate: the deliberate intervention of human malice. As you surrender to the deep, comforting stillness of the night, the story of these dedicated craftsmen invites your mind into a state of profound rest. The silver ships sailed through the challenges of their time with an unyielding dignity, their immense hulls holding a delicate balance between earth and sky. They moved like silent guardians of a higher ideal, their engines singing a slow, hypnotic melody over the darkened continents. And as the night wraps the world in its protective embrace, we leave them floating peacefully in the quiet corridors of memory, their silver structures gleaming softly under the stars, watching over a calm, sleeping earth that is entirely at peace. Chapter 6. The Spark at Lakehurst. To look back at the warm, heavy evening of May 6, 1937, is to witness the intersection of flawless human effort and an unexplained, defining moment of catastrophe. The airfield at the Lakehurst Naval Air Station in New Jersey was enveloped in a quiet, humid twilight. After a long, somewhat turbulent transatlantic crossing from Frankfurt, the Hindenburg, the grandest, most technologically sophisticated airship ever constructed, was slowly approaching its final mooring mast. The passengers, having spent the last 3 days relaxing in the absolute quiet of the ship's walnut-paneled lounges and listening to the soft notes of the aluminum grand piano, were leaning against the panoramic windows, waving to the crowds gathered below. The massive silver ship hovered over the dark field like a gentle, weightless cloud, suspended in a state of perfect, peaceful equilibrium. Then, at exactly 7:25 in the evening, a tiny, mysterious spark appeared near the upper fin of the stern. In a matter of 34 seconds, the magnificent Titan was gone, its delicate duralumin framework collapsing gracefully into the sand as the millions of cubic feet of hydrogen burned away into the darkened sky. The official government investigations, conducted quickly in the weeks that followed, concluded that the disaster was an unfortunate act of nature, a tragic combination of a structural gas leak and static electricity from a passing thunderstorm. To the casual observer, it was a closed chapter, a simple failure of physics. Yet, if one steps away from the official reports and looks into the deeper, quieter corners of the historical record, a collection of strange anomalies and alternative theories begins to emerge, suggesting that the spark at Lakehurst may not have been accidental at all. When we look through the lens of those who designed and loved the ship, the official static electricity theory starts to lose its simple certainty. The captain of the airship, Max Pruss, along with the legendary commander Ernst Lehmann, were men who had spent their entire lives navigating hydrogen vessels through violent storms, lightning strikes, and extreme atmospheric conditions without a single incident. They knew the Hindenburg was perfectly bonded. Its complex network of copper wires was designed to equalize electrical charges automatically across its vast silver skin. In the hours before the landing, Learman himself had commented on how calm the air had become. Furthermore, several experienced ground crew members, who were standing directly beneath the tail of the ship, reported seeing a small, concentrated flash of light inside the hull, near gas cell number 4, moments before the fire broke out on the exterior skin. It was a localized event, independent of the external weather. This has led many researchers and historians to consider the profound possibility of internal sabotage. The Hindenburg was not just a commercial vehicle. It was a floating symbol of national prestige, a soaring testament to independence from the international fuel and banking syndicates that were trying to control the globe. There were those who desperately wanted to see this technology fail, to prove once and for all that airships were too dangerous for the modern world. In the days leading up to the fateful flight, the German authorities had received multiple written warnings detailing a specific bomb threat against the ship. A young rigger named Erich Spell, who worked in the isolated stern of the vessel and had access to the precise area where the fire originated, became the focus of private investigations. It was whispered that a small, lightweight incendiary device, triggered by a simple clockwork pocket watch, had been placed inside gas cell number 4, designed to ignite safely after the passengers had disembarked, but triggered early due to the landing delays. Other compelling theories point to the unique composition of the airship's outer fabric coating. Decades after the disaster, specialized researchers examining the original blueprints and surviving fabric fragments discovered that the silver paint used to reflect sunlight from the hull contained a dangerous mixture of iron oxide and powdered aluminum, the exact chemical ingredients used to create thermite, a highly volatile incendiary compound. If an electrical short circuit or a small, deliberate electrical device had been activated near the fabric, the skin itself would have burned with a ferocious, unstoppable intensity, completely independent of whether the hydrogen inside was leaking or not. The hydrogen may have simply fueled a fire that had already been intentionally set by forces hidden within the infrastructure of the journey. Yet, despite these haunting questions, the true origin of the spark remains locked forever in the silence of the past. No absolute, definitive proof of a conspiracy was ever officially permitted to surface. The industrial powers and the global media syndicates had no interest in a prolonged investigation into sabotage or fuel monopolies. They needed an immediate, clean narrative of technological failure. The image of the burning Titan was broadcast around the world, transforming the Hindenburg into a cautionary tale rather than a victim of a corporate war. But as you rest in the safety and stillness of this night, you can look back at that silver giant with a sense of deep admiration for the peace it represented. The ship was a dream of harmony, brought down not by its own inherent flaws, but by the turbulent forces of a changing world. And now, the great ship rests in the quiet valleys of history, its memory floating safely among the stars, while the world beneath drifts into a deep, protected, and beautiful slumber. Chapter 7. The Syndicate's Media Engine. To understand how an entire era of human transportation can be erased from the collective consciousness in a matter of weeks, one must look away from the physical wreckage at Lakehurst and examine the invisible architecture of public opinion. In the 1930s, the world was entering a new age of mass communication. For the first time in history, a single event could be recorded, packaged, and distributed across the globe with unprecedented speed through the dual engines of the newsreel and the synchronized radio broadcast. This media apparatus possessed a terrifyingly beautiful power. It could shape what people believed, what they feared, and how they envisioned the future. And behind this vast machinery of information stood the very same financial syndicates that had spent a decade choking off the capital and resources of the rigid airship. When the Hindenburg met its sudden end on that heavy New Jersey evening, the media response was not a slow, cautious gathering of facts. It was an instantaneous, highly coordinated explosion of narrative. At the edge of the airfield stood a young radio reporter named Herbert Morrison, whose emotional, breathless live recording of the crash became the defining soundtrack of the disaster. His trembling voice, crying out into the night, was captured on a wax disc and rushed to every major radio network. Within 48 hours, the audio of his panic was synchronized with dramatic, slow-motion film footage shot by newsreel crews who just happened to have their heavy cameras perfectly positioned to capture the exact moment the spark appeared. It was a sensory blitzkrieg. The public was not permitted a moment of quiet reflection or a period of scientific mourning. They were immediately subjected to a relentless loop of fire, noise, and destruction. The orchestration of this media campaign was a masterpiece of psychological engineering. The industrial syndicates understood that to fully clear the skies for the oil-thirsty commercial airplane, they could not merely prove that the airship had crashed, they had to make the very concept of the airship a source of deep, visceral terror. The newspapers and newsreels, which relied heavily on advertising revenue from massive automotive corporations and petroleum conglomerates, began a systematic campaign of exaggeration and omission. Every front page across the Western world featured the exact same terrifying image of the burning duralumin frame, accompanied by sensationalist headlines that painted the Zeppelin as a fundamentally unworkable, apocalyptic technology. What the media engine deliberately chose to omit from its global broadcast was the astonishing truth of human survival. In the history of major transportation disasters, very few events of that visual scale had ever resulted in such a high percentage of survivors. Out of the 97 people on board that evening, 62 walked away from the burning frame alive. The structural engineering of the ship had held together beautifully as it settled, protecting the passenger quarters from the worst of the heat and allowing the majority of the travelers to simply step out onto the sand. Furthermore, the media completely ignored the flawless, million-mile safety record of the Graf Zeppelin, which had spent a decade crossing oceans without a single injury. By turning a single, highly anomalous event into the universal definition of the technology, the media syndicates created an artificial truth. They transformed a magnificent triumph of sustainable engineering into a synonym for catastrophe. Within a single month of the Lakehurst disaster, public perception had shifted completely. The sense of wonder, peace, and unhurried luxury that had defined the Silver Giants for a generation was thoroughly replaced by a deep, manufactured anxiety. People forgot the profound silence of the cabins. They forgot the elegant efficiency of the Maybach diesel engines. They forgot the clean, ecological harmony of drifting with the wind. When they looked up at the sky, they no longer saw a beautiful dream of a sustainable future. They saw an imaginary fireball. The trap had been sprung with absolute precision. The media engine had successfully weaponized a tragedy, using the raw power of emotion and repetition to close the book on the airship forever, leaving the heavens completely open for the rise of the resource-heavy aviation empires. As you allow your mind to settle into the deep, protective quiet of this evening, you can see past the noise and the illusions of that ancient media machinery. The truth remains resting in the quiet spaces of history, untouched by the panic of the crowds. The airships belonged to an ideal of gentleness and balance, an architecture of silence that was simply too pure for the aggressive spirit of their age. And as the darkness wraps the world in a soft, velvet blanket, we leave the Silver Giants floating safely within the calm, undisturbed sanctuary of our memory, their true legacy preserved under the watchful gaze of the stars, while the busy world beneath drifts into a deep, restorative, and beautiful sleep. Chapter 8: The Forgotten Skies. With the global media campaign having successfully anchored the emotion of terror to the image of the Silver Giants, The final act of this quiet corporate war was executed away from the public gaze, deep within the silent hangars where the remaining airships rested. The public had been prepared to look away, and so the industrial syndicates moved swiftly to ensure that the physical proof of this alternative, sustainable future would be completely erased from the face of the earth. There would be no museums to preserve these monuments of human harmony, no quiet sanctuaries where future generations could stand beneath the immense duralumin arches and wonder what might have been. The order was given for total disassembly, a systematic clearing of the sky. In the spring of 1940, a heavy silence settled over the great hangars at Frankfurt and Friedrichshafen. The Graf Zeppelin, the legendary pioneer that had sailed over 1 million miles across the globe without a single scratched piece of paint, was deflated, its massive fabric skin folded away like an old canvas sail. Beside it sat the newly completed Graf Zeppelin II, a masterpiece of safety engineering that had been designed to fix every vulnerability of the past. Under the direct orders of the wartime authorities, men heavily influenced by the industrial combines that required aluminum and fuel for heavy weaponry, the demolition crews arrived. For weeks, the only sound inside those grand, cathedral-like spaces was the slow, metallic scream of saws and rivets being forced apart. The brilliant, lightweight duralumin frames, crafted with the precision of fine Swiss watches, were broken down, melted into raw ingots, and fed directly into the roaring furnaces of the heavy manufacturing sector. The victory of the oil empires and the internal combustion syndicates was absolute, definitive, and complete. Within a few short years, the infrastructure of global travel was permanently locked into a single, aggressive paradigm. The skies, which had once been a realm of unhurried peace, were handed over entirely to the commercial airplane. As the mid-century approached, the atmosphere became a crowded grid of roaring engines, high-altitude exhaust trails, and an insatiable, multi-billion-gallon daily demand for petroleum products. The global economy had successfully secured its absolute customer, a transportation system that could not exist for a single second without the continuous burning of fossil fuels. The gentle path of static buoyancy, which offered connection without consumption, was buried beneath a mountain of industrial contracts, drilling rights, and high-speed timetables. As the decades drifted past, humanity slowly developed a profound collective amnesia. We forgot what it felt like to cross an ocean without the frantic, pressurized anxiety of modern flight. We forgot that there was once a technology that allowed hundreds of people to drift through the clouds in absolute silence, listening to the natural cadence of the wind rather than the deafening scream of a jet turbine. We lost a beautiful piece of our relationship with the earth, a peaceful legacy where the journey itself was an experience of deep rest, a slow, majestic transition from one culture to another, balanced delicately on the invisible currents of the atmosphere. The airships became ghosts, fairy tales from an era that felt too gentle to be real. Yet, as we lie here in the deep, protective stillness of the night, we can understand that no true legacy is ever completely lost. The dream of the silver giants remains resting quietly in the deep archives of human potential, waiting for a wiser, calmer age to look up at the clouds once more. They remind us that progress does not always have to be loud, aggressive, and destructive, that human ingenuity is entirely capable of creating systems that work in absolute harmony with the natural physics of our world. The long journey through this hidden history is now complete, and the sky is finally still. The ledgers are closed, the boardrooms are empty, and the ancient currents of the wind continue to blow across the dark, sleeping continents just as they always have. You are entirely safe, warm, and protected from the noise of the modern world. The silver ships have found their eternal harbor in the quiet spaces of our dreams, their majestic hulls gleaming softly under the timeless light of the stars. The night is deep, the sky is clear, and the world is floating into a profound, restorative, and beautiful sleep.